My husband's family treated me like an embarrassment until I became their only way out. They never said it directly, they didn't have to. It was in the way his mother asked me if I needed help understanding the wine list, in the way his sister complimented my ambition, the same way someone might praise a child for drawing inside the lines. Every interaction was a gentle reminder. I hadn't gone to the right schools, read the right books, or worn the right last name. That night, over candlelight and crystal glasses, the message sharpened. I was unfit, not for their son, but for their image. My husband reached for my hand under the table. I didn't take it. Instead, I stood, filled my glass to the rim, and raised it to no one in particular, to the ones who never fit in and make it anyway. Then I walked out, not in shame, but with clarity, so loud it silenced every fork and every judgment in the room. I didn't grow up with legacy dinnerware or summer homes in Nantucket. I grew up in a trailer parked behind my aunt's house in rural Texas where the air was dry and the dust clung to everything, especially your dreams. My father died when I was 6, a car crash on the way home from his night shift. After that, it was just me and my mother. She cleaned houses during the day and sewed handmade quilts at night to make ends meet. She used to say, "Don't wait for doors to open, sweetheart. Build your own damn door." I didn't go to college, I couldn't. Instead, I started selling handmade jewelry online while working 3 jobs. Every dollar I made felt like a battle won. I didn't have pedigree, but I had grit. I met Jacob at a summer leadership camp in Colorado. He was there as a speaker. I was a last-minute fill-in for someone who dropped out. I thought he'd overlook me the moment I mentioned where I was from. Instead, he leaned in, asked questions, really listened. He said I had founder energy. I laughed at the time and thought he was being nice, but he kept showing up. Emails, texts, video calls. I learned he came from a family of academics, every one of them with degrees from Ivy League schools. His mom was a historian, his dad was a published author, his world was polished, articulate, and certain. Mine was patched together with duct tape and ambition. When we started dating, I'd take buses across state lines just to see him for a weekend. Once, I missed my connection and spent the night at a gas station, wrapped in a hoodie and hope. He never made me feel small for it. In fact, he said it made him admire me more. For a long time, he was my safe place, the one who made me feel like I wasn't just surviving but starting to matter. I was so used to being the one who supported others. With him, for once, I felt held. When he brought me home to Boston for the first time, I tried. I memorized the names of philosophers I'd never read, practiced drinking wine without looking clueless, and stayed up late Googling what summa cum laude actually meant. His family was polite but distant, his mother especially, the kind of woman who could kill you with a compliment. "You're very driven," she said, in a tone that made driven sound like a rash. But I didn't care. Jacob loved me. I loved him. I believed love was enough. When we got married, I used all my savings to help launch our first home goods startup. I designed, packed, and shipped every order by hand for months. When we couldn't afford an assistant, I worked double shifts. When the website crashed during Black Friday, I stayed up for 36 hours straight fixing it. He called me the engine. I wore that like a badge of honor. I thought I had found my place in his world, that maybe eventually the rest of them would see what he saw. But some people only see what fits into their own reflection, and I was never part of theirs. Looking back, I don't know if I was naive or just hopelessly optimistic, maybe both. I truly believed that time and effort would close the gap between me and the expectations of his world. I took etiquette classes on weekends, YouTube videos at first, then a course. I paid for in installments. I practiced my pitch tone for meetings, watched how women in his circle dressed and spoke, and adapted as best I could. It wasn't about pretending to be someone else. It was about trying to be enough for the life I was building. And yet, no matter how much I learned or how far the business grew, I was always Jacob's ambitious wife, never a force in my own right. At dinner parties, they'd ask him about our company, even when I was the one who ran day-to-day operations. Still, I kept showing up. For him. For us. I told myself it didn't matter, that one day they'd see me clearly, that love and persistence would bridge what legacy and lineage couldn't. I didn't realize then that being tolerated isn't the same as being accepted. It started with the little things, the kind that makes you question if you're being too sensitive. Like the time Jacob's mother Elise handed me the wine list at a restaurant and asked with that rehearsed smile, "Do you need help understanding the pairings?" She said it kindly, like she was doing me a favor, but the waiter caught my eye and flinched. He knew. Or the time Jacob's sister Caroline leaned across the table during brunch and said, "You're so ambitious, it's adorable." I smiled back, too tightly, and stirred my coffee like I was trying to drown the irritation. They never raised their voices, that would have been too obvious, too crass, no. The slights came polished and quiet, hidden beneath polished silverware and academic references I wasn't expected to follow. At family functions, Elise would introduce me as Jacob's wife, the one with the small business, her voice catching slightly on the word small. When I corrected her, well, we just hit our first million in revenue. She nodded politely and moved on as if I'd said something impolite. Once I overheard her on the phone with a friend. "She's hard-working, I'll give her that, but she didn't exactly come from much. It's been an adjustment." Another time, Jacob and I attended a fundraiser at the Boston Public Library. Elise spent half the evening parading a young woman named Clara, Harvard graduate, Rhodes Scholar, goddaughter of someone on the board, right in front of me. "You two should talk," she said, her eyes lingering a little too long on Jacob. "You have so much in common." Jacob brushed it off. "She just wants to show off," he said later when I brought it up. "It's not about you." But it was always about me. And it wasn't just Elise. Their friends would ask questions that weren't questions. "How did you two meet again?" Or, "It must be so refreshing for Jacob to be with someone so grounded." Grounded, meaning beneath. At dinners, conversations would drift into books I hadn't read and theories I hadn't studied. I'd nod, ask questions, and try to follow. And when I spoke about marketing trends, international growth, scaling logistics, they'd tilt their heads like I was performing a trick. The worst part, I tried to fit in. I tried too hard. I read the books, practiced my pronunciation, and even changed the way I dressed. I told myself it was growth, not erasure, that I was expanding, not shrinking. But there's a special kind of loneliness in being surrounded by people who smile at you like you're a guest in your own life. Jacob saw it, I think, but he didn't challenge it, not really. He'd squeeze my hand under the table, whisper, "Ignore her," or "Let it go." And for a while I did, because I loved him, because I thought love meant bending until you fit, because I thought eventually they'd stop testing the edges of my worth. But they didn't. They just got better at pretending they weren't. There was this one dinner, Elise's book club gathering, where I sat between a woman who taught literature at Yale and another who ran a think tank in DC. They spoke in tight, clever phrases, referencing essays I had never read and conferences I'd never be invited to. I tried to chime in and mentioned a marketing campaign I had just launched. The Yale professor smiled and said, "Oh, you work in advertising." I opened my mouth to correct her, to explain what we did was more about brand ecosystems and cultural insights, but Elise touched my arm and said, "She runs a lovely shop online, very creative." A shop, like it was a hobby, like I hadn't built something real, something that paid other people's salaries. And then there were the looks, the ones I caught between Elise and Caroline. Whenever someone mentioned degrees or travel or the arts, I was the outsider, the hopeful project they never quite finished remodeling. They'd always compare me to the ideal daughter-in-law types, like Clara or another girl named Lillian who once interned at the UN. "She's doing amazing things," Elise would say. with a glance so sharp it could peel skin. I started dreading holidays, not because of the work, but because I knew I'd spend the whole evening proving I belonged, or pretending it didn't bother me that I didn't. Eventually, I stopped talking in some rooms, not because I had nothing to say, but because I was tired of translating myself. That silence, I think, was what they wanted all along. The night of the betrayal was supposed to be a celebration. Our company had just secured its first $1 million contract. I spent weeks negotiating the deal, flying between time zones, sleeping in airports, and pitching to investors who called me darling and sweetheart, but signed the check anyway. Jacob wanted to host a dinner at his parents' home in Boston, a formal affair, the kind with name cards and cloth napkins folded like swans. I agreed, thinking maybe this time they'd see me differently. Maybe now, with this contract, I'd proven I belonged. Elise greeted me at the door with her usual smile, tight-lipped and scanning. Caroline handed me a glass of wine and said, "Congrats, CEO," in a tone that made the title sound like a nickname for a pet. The first half of the evening was civil. We laughed, exchanged stories, and toasted champagne. Jacob gave a small speech, thanking me for my vision and grit. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe we had turned a corner. Then dessert came. Elise tapped her spoon against her glass gently, the way she always did when she was about to take over a room. "I think we should toast," she said, lifting her wine, "to success and to remembering where we come from." There was a pause. Then she looked directly at me. "Because no matter how much money we make," she continued, "it's important not to forget our roots, or, in some cases, lack thereof." The room fell silent. No one moved, not Jacob, not his father, not Caroline. The only sound was the clink of a fork dropped somewhere near the end of the table. I felt every pair of eyes on me, waiting. I set my fork down slowly. My palms were cold, though my face was burning. I looked at Jacob, hoping, no, begging for him to say something, to speak, to call her out. He cleared his throat. Then I took a sip of wine. I don't remember if I stood up or if my legs just moved on their own, but I remember the sound of my chair scraping back. I remember the weight of the silence. And I remember Elise's face, not smug, not angry, just satisfied, like she'd finally restored the natural order. I left the table. I walked out of the dining room, out of the house, into the freezing Boston night. I stood on the porch, breathing hard, watching my breath fog up in front of me. Jacob followed me outside a few minutes later. "She didn't mean it that way," he said quietly. I left. Loud, sharp. "Then how did she mean it, Jacob?" She gets uncomfortable with change, with attention." "No," I said, "she gets uncomfortable with me." He didn't argue. I asked him, "Why didn't you say anything?" He looked down at his shoes. It wasn't the right time. That was the moment something cracked. Not loudly, not a dramatic shatter, but like ice beginning to split beneath your feet. I realized I couldn't count on him to stand beside me when it mattered most. Not when it was inconvenient, not when it required courage. Later that night, I received a text from Elise. No apology, just a single line. "I hope you didn't take it personally." Personally? I had built a company from scratch. I had poured every hour, every cent, every ounce of self-worth into something real. And in her eyes, I was still just a girl from nowhere who got lucky. I didn't reply. I just stared at the screen, the glow of it lighting up the truth I had tried so hard not to see. They didn't just disapprove of me. They didn't respect me. And maybe the worst part was realizing I had let them treat me like that for so long. I'd allowed it, all of it, thinking that someday I'd be enough for them. But the truth was, no version of me ever would be. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake in our apartment, staring at the ceiling while Jacob slept soundly beside me, or pretended to. My mind kept looping through every second of that dinner, every look, every silence, every missed opportunity for someone to speak up. I thought about how I had defended that family, excused them, justified their coldness in the name of old money awkwardness or intellectual snobbery. But I don't, it felt like a betrayal by a thousand cuts, and I was bleeding from all of them. The next morning, Jacob acted like nothing had happened. He made coffee, scrolled his phone, and asked if I wanted eggs. I stared at him in disbelief. "Do you understand what last night was?" I finally asked. He paused, then shrugged. It was tense, but that's just how my mom is. "No," I said, "that's who she chooses to be, and you let her." We didn't fight. There was nothing left to fight with, just a quiet, hollow distance where something used to be. For days after, I went through the motions, meetings, emails, calls. I did it all like muscle memory. But I felt detached from everything. The deal I had landed felt meaningless. The success I had built felt invisible. Force, I started questioning myself. Had I overreacted? Was I too sensitive? Was it just a joke I didn't get? But every time I imagined my mother standing on her feet 12 hours a day to buy me textbooks, I knew the answer. Elise hadn't insulted just me. She had insulted every piece of me that had ever fought for this life. And Jacobs, he didn't just fail to defend me. He validated her silence with his own. Something shifted in me after that night, not in rage, not in rebellion, but in resolve. I realized I had been trying to earn respect in a room that was never built for me to stand in. So I decided I'd build my own. I didn't quit out loud. I didn't throw things or scream or leave a note. I just slowed down. For days, I couldn't bring myself to open my laptop. Emails piled up, unread. My team texted updates, questions, check-ins, and I couldn't even type back a "got it." I wasn't burnt out, I was emptied. The apartment felt like a museum of someone else's life. The white walls, the curated furniture, the art pieces Jacob's family had gifted us, all of it suddenly felt foreign, like I had wandered into a show home where nothing had fingerprint. I slept on the couch for almost a week, told Jacob it was because I was working late, but we both knew that wasn't it. I stopped attending meetings, I rescheduled investor calls, I skipped a major pitch presentation I had spent months preparing. The team handled it barely, and no one said anything, but I knew they noticed. What hurt most wasn't Elise's words. It was how quickly my fire dimmed after them. Like she hadn't just insulted me, she had found the exact fracture in my spirit and pressed. I started wondering if she was right, if I had just been lucky, if I had clawed my way into a world that was never going to accept me, and worse, that I didn't truly belong in. One night, I sat in the bathtub with the water gone cold, still wearing a t-shirt, just staring at the faucet. I wasn't crying. I didn't even feel sad, just gone. I thought about shutting down the company, selling what I could, moving back to Texas, buying a small shop, maybe something slow, quiet, a life that didn't ask me to prove myself every time I entered a room. But then my phone lit up. It was my mother, a FaceTime call. I almost let it ring out, but something, maybe habit, maybe guilt, made me answer. She was sitting at the kitchen table, wearing her old glasses, a bowl of laundry beside her. "Hey, baby," she said, smiling. "You look tired." I didn't answer. She just kept folding towels. You remember that time in 6th grade, she said, when they didn't let you into the science fair because you didn't have the entry fee? I nodded. "You built your project anyway, stuck it outside the gym with a sign that said this counts too. People stopped. Do you remember that?" I nodded again, tears stinging now. She looked at me through the screen. "You don't need a seat at their table, honey. You built your own damn building. Don't let one woman make you feel like you didn't." I broke then, fully. The tears came fast and ugly. I cried for that little girl with the science fair sign. I cried for the woman who still thought she needed permission to be proud. My mom just kept folding towels, letting me fall apart without flinching. That call didn't fix everything, but it cracked something open just enough for air to get in. Just enough for me to start breathing again. After that call, I sat alone in the dark for a long time. Jacob came home late that night. He saw my red eyes and didn't ask. Just walked into the bedroom and closed the door. We hadn't spoken much since the dinner. Not really. Surface words, yes. Groceries, emails, don't forget to lock up. But nothing real. Nothing that touched what we were both avoiding. It hit me then. This wasn't just about Elise, it was about him too. About the way he let silence speak louder than loyalty. About how he let the woman he loved be slowly carving down, piece by piece, and called it keeping the peace. I looked at our wedding photo on the bookshelf. We looked so sure, so full of possibilities. I barely recognized that version of us. I thought about what it would mean to leave, what it would cost, not just financially, but emotionally. Would walking away prove them right, that I wasn't cut out for this world? Or would staying be worse? I realized I had been measuring my worth through their approval for so long, I didn't know how to value myself without it. But my mother's words kept echoing, "You built your own damn building." She was right. Every win, every late night, every hard choice, it was mine. And I wasn't done. Not yet. The next morning, I showered, really showered for the first time in days. I brewed coffee, opened my laptop, and read every email I had ignored. I didn't reply, not yet, but I read them. And I made a list, a real one, not just of tasks, but of reasons to keep going. It wasn't hope yet, but it was something close. And recovery wasn't dramatic. It didn't come in the form of some grand gesture or sudden revelation. It came quietly, in routines, in decisions, in the small, stubborn act of showing up. Start setting my alarm again, 5 a.m. like before. The first few mornings I just sat there blinking in the dark, but I was up. That counted. I began journaling, something I hadn't done in years. Not for insight, but to unclog the noise in my head. At first, it was all anger, at Elise, at Jacob, at myself. But over time, the rage softened into clarity. What I wanted wasn't revenge. I wanted freedom. From their judgment, from needing to be enough, from shrinking myself into something palatable. So I worked not to prove anything, but because the work was mine. It was the one place where no one could interrupt me, correct me, or finish my sentences. I reassessed our business strategy. We'd been focusing too much on domestic expansion, playing it safe. I proposed a pivot toward Asia, where demand for sustainable home goods was rising fast. My team was surprised, but they trusted me. Hired a new project manager in Singapore, booked a flight, and went myself. Jacob didn't ask where I was going. I didn't offer. Some distances don't need bridges. Singapore changed everything. Being in a place where no one knew me, where no one cared who my in-laws were or what school I went to, reminded me of who I was without their shadow. I gave a keynote at a women's leadership summit. Halfway through my speech, I looked up and realized they were actually listening. Not politely, not tolerantly, but with genuine interest. That night, I sat alone at a rooftop bar, drink in hand, overlooking Marina Bay. I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry. I was whole. A week later, we signed our largest international deal to date. Back home, I restructured the company, promoted women who had been overlooked, set new policies around parental leave and mental health days, built the kind of workplace I wished I'd had when I started. One morning, I received an email from Forbes. They wanted to feature me in their 30 under 30 list. I laughed out of disbelief, but because for the first time, recognition felt like a reflection, not a rescue. I didn't tell Jacob right away. When I did, he looked up from his phone and said, "That's great, babe," then went back to scrolling. Something settled in me then. It wasn't that he didn't care. It was that he didn't see me anymore. But I did. And that was enough. The more distance I put between myself and that house in Boston, the clearer everything became. I saw how often I had apologized for taking up space, how I'd made myself smaller to ease their discomfort. I thought about all the times I'd double-checked my tone, my posture, and my opinions, just to seem appropriate. Appropriate for what? For who? In Singapore, I stayed up late talking to other women founders over street food and tea. We shared stories about being underestimated, overlooked, and misread. It didn't fix anything, but it reminded me that I wasn't alone, and that strength doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like endurance, strategy, grace is under pressure. When I returned to the US, I didn't go back to the apartment right away. I checked into a hotel downtown and took 2 days off the grid. No meetings, no emails, just silence. It was the first time I had allowed myself to feel proud without needing anyone to confirm it. Eventually, I met with our investors and proposed a full rebrand. New name, new aesthetic, new narrative, not just a company built from nothing, but one that redefined what nothing meant. They approved. I left that meeting with a folder in one hand and my spine a little straighter. Later that week, I received a package from Elise. Inside was a framed photo of Jacob as a child and a note. Thought you might want this for your office. No apology, no acknowledgement, just another artifact of a life that no longer fits. I wrapped the photo back in its paper and placed it in a drawer. Not out of malice, but because I had finally learned what to carry forward and what to leave behind. The healing didn't look like fireworks, it looked like focus, and for the first time in a long time, I had plenty of it. Revenge wasn't the point, clarity was. So when I planned the surprise, a 2-week luxury trip to Switzerland for Jacob's family, it wasn't out of spite, it was calculated, precise, a farewell masked as generosity. First, I upgraded their flights to business class. Elise had never flown that way before. She once said flying economy kept her humble, though she always booked priority boarding. I booked them suites overlooking the Matterhorn, complete with spa treatments and private chefs. The itinerary came with a handwritten note, "Enjoy the rest you've earned, no need to send updates." Elise texted me a string of emojis, champagne glasses, hearts, a snowflake, no words, none needed. I didn't go with them. When Jacob asked why, I looked him straight in the eye and said, "It's a gift, not a reunion." He didn't push back. While they were in the Alps, I moved out, quietly. I hired movers, packed only what was mine, and left the rest. The wedding china, the framed family portraits, even the monogrammed towels Elise had insisted we register for. I left a note. "I'm not angry. I'm done." I stayed at a friend's loft downtown, the kind with creaky wood floors and no dishwasher, and I slept better than I had in months. Word got around, our social circle buzzed. Elise called twice, I didn't answer. Caroline emailed to check in. I didn't reply. For the first time, I let silence serve me. Then came the gala, a charity benefit I'd helped organize months earlier. Everyone who mattered in Jacob's world would be there, scholars, donors, Boston royalty. I walked in alone. Wore a black jumpsuit tailored like armor. No jewelry but a cuff engraved with the word, "enough." When Elise saw me, her smile twitched. "You look strong," she said. I thanked her and walked past. During the auction, I made the highest donation of the night in the name of my mother. I saw Jacob blink, startled. He mouthed something. I didn't look twice. That night, I went home to my loft, poured a glass of wine, and toasted myself. Not for escaping, for returning. On my own terms. The next morning, an article went live. The headline, "From Outsider to Architect, How One Founder Rewrote the Rules of Legacy." My face on the cover, my words are in print. I didn't send it to Jacob, but I knew he saw it, and I knew he understood what the trip, the silence, and the final walkout really were. not revenge, just resolution. I knew what people would say, that I was being dramatic, cruel, even ungrateful, that I should have stayed and worked through it, but they hadn't lived it. They hadn't swallowed the smallness of every backhanded compliment or absorbed the sting of 100 polite exclusions. The Switzerland trip wasn't an olive branch, it was a mirror held up to show them what power looks like when it's wielded quietly, cleanly, without apology. While they sent selfies on ski lifts and snapshots of fondue dinners, I signed off on 3 new contracts, launched a new product line, gave a TEDx talk. People noticed, brands called, speaking invites followed. I became the woman magazines asked about, not the one they footnoted. One night, while reviewing mock-ups for our new campaign, I found a photo tucked into one of my old notebooks. It was from our wedding, me and Jacob dancing, heads tilted toward each other like we were in on a secret. I stared at it for a long time. Then I shredded it. Not out of anger, out of certainty. Because sometimes power isn't in what you keep, it's in what you're no longer afraid to let go of. By the time Jacob and his family returned from Switzerland, I was already somewhere else, mentally, emotionally, physically. I had moved into a smaller place with bigger windows, more light, less noise. He showed up one afternoon, unannounced. I let him in, and he looked around, then asked, "Is this what you want?" I didn't answer. He looked tired, worn in a way I hadn't seen before. "I didn't know how to fight them," he said quietly. "I didn't know how to choose." "You didn't have to," I replied. "You just had to choose me." He nodded, and then he left. I didn't cry. I just stood there, feeling the weight lift, not because I had won, but because I had stopped playing their game. A week later, I sent Elise a box. Inside was a single object, the cuff I had worn at the gala, the one engraved with "enough." No note, no explanation. I imagined her opening it, trying to decode the meaning. Maybe she'd think it was a jab, maybe a thank you, maybe nothing at all. But I didn't care. It wasn't for her. It was for me a closing loop, a full stop, a final punctuation on the version of me who once needed her approval to breathe. I no longer needed permission, not to walk into a room, not to speak, not to stay, and especially not to leave. That was the true reversal. Not power over them, power back to myself. I didn't plan on hearing from Elise again, not really. But a few months after the trip, Jacob called. It was the middle of a Monday. I was between back-to-back meetings when his name flashed on my phone. I hesitated, then picked up. "Elise is in the hospital," he said. "Heart surgery. It's urgent." I paused. "I'm sorry to hear that. We need help. The insurance doesn't cover all of it. I know it's asking a lot, but the card for the business," he didn't finish. He didn't have to. I told him I'd take care of it. No questions, no lectures, just a wire transfer and a single condition. I wouldn't be visiting. He didn't argue. Later that week, the hospital confirmed the payment had gone through. I didn't expect gratitude, but I received something I never anticipated. A handwritten, no return address, just my name on the envelope. It was from Elise. The paper was thick, the handwriting careful. He wrote, "I've spent my life believing certain names meant something, that education, lineage, polish. These were the things that proved worth. I was wrong." She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't try to explain. But she ended the letter with one line: "If Jacob ever grows into the man you needed him to be, I hope it's not too late." I folded the letter once, placed it in a drawer, not to forget it, but to file it away, the way you file away a receipt from something you've already resolved. I didn't reply because this wasn't a story that needed to loop back. It needed to close. That week, Jacob emailed again. No subject line, just a single sentence: "I miss who we were." I didn't answer that either. It wasn't bitterness, it was clarity. He was still looking backward, and I had never been more forward-facing in my life. Word spread fast. Elise, once the matriarch who curated perfection like a personal brand, was now the subject of quiet pity at country clubs and charity luncheons. People whispered, not because of the surgery, but because of who paid for it. No one said it out loud, but I could feel the shift. The same people who once introduced me as Jacob's wife now paused before adding, the founder. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very legacy Elise had clung to, the old money, the academic bloodlines, the curated social capital, couldn't save her, but the girl from Texas with a Shopify account and a spreadsheet could. Carolyn reached out once too, a polite email dressed in pleasantries. She said she admired how I handled everything with such poise. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because I remembered when she called me relentlessly ambitious, like it was a flaw. Now, as a virtue, what none of them understood was that I hadn't done it for them, not even for closure. I had done it because power without compassion is just ego. And I didn't want to become what they had been to me. But compassion didn't mean reconnection. I didn't visit, I didn't text, I didn't send flowers. Some bridges don't burn. They dissolve quietly, completely, when you stop walking back across them. And that, I've learned, is its own kind of justice. A few weeks later, I found the letter again while cleaning. I read it one last time, slowly, quietly. This time, it didn't sting, it didn't move me, it just confirmed what I had suspected all along, that some people only understand worth when it comes wrapped in usefulness. And I was done being useful to them, not out of anger, out of self-respect. I placed the letter in a sealed envelope, wrote the year on it, and tucked it in a box labeled past. That's where it belonged. Not in my hands, not in my future, but in the archive of lessons I never needed to learn twice. These days, I live by the ocean. Not in a glass tower or behind iron gates, but in a modest villa tucked into a hillside in Bali, the kind of place where windows stay open, where the sea breeze replaces air conditioning, and where shoes are mostly optional. I wake up with the sun, stretch barefoot on the porch, and listen to birds instead of inbox pings. There's still work, always is, but now it flows, not chases. I founded a center for women entrepreneurs here. We meet under a thatched roof, seated in a circle, laptops on laps, babies sometimes in arms. There's no hierarchy, no polished pitches, no gatekeeping. Just ideas, mentorship, and a quiet ferocity that comes from women who've had to build their way forward. Some of them remind me of who I was at 22, scrappy, hopeful, trying to speak a language no one taught them. I don't give them advice. I listen. I offer resources. Mostly I make space. And in making space for them, I made peace with myself. I don't check Jacob's socials. I don't Google Elise. The past isn't a ghost. It's just another country. I don't need to revisit. Sometimes I think about that dinner, the one that shattered the illusion. I wonder how long I would have stayed if Elise hadn't said what she did. Years, forever. Maybe that night was a gift, not wrapped in kindness, but in truth. Because here's what I know now. Value isn't something someone else hands you, it's what you carry and how you show up. When no one claps, when no one says thank you, when you're building alone in the dark. Respect isn't granted, it's enforced by what you tolerate and what you walk away from. And legacy? Legacy isn't a surname, a donation plaque, or a story others tell about you. It's the lives you touch, the change you enable, the space you leave better than you found it. I used to chase seats at other people's tables. Now, I build longer tables and I make sure there's room for every woman still finding her voice. That is the only kind of power I believe in now. The kind you don't need to wear loud. the kind that doesn't need to be recognized to be real. Every few months, I take a walk to the same beach, the one just past the bend where the tourists don't usually go. I sit on a rock with my coffee and watch the tide pull and return over and over like a kind of forgiveness. One morning, I found a little girl building a sandcastle there, alone. She looked up at me and smiled, then asked, "Do you think it'll last?" I knelt beside her and said, "It doesn't have to. You can always build it again, stronger." She nodded like she already knew. That's what this place has taught me, that starting over isn't a failure, that release is not a weakness, that walking away isn't the end, it's often the beginning of something finally fully yours. I no longer count wins by headlines or deposits. I count them in faces and quiet courage, in how long I can sit still without needing to be seen. And maybe that's what power really is. Not improving yourself, but in knowing you don't have to.